There is a specific breed of suburban nightmare that doesn't involve ghosts, home invasions, or collapsing foundations. It involves a pristine four-bedroom colonial house, bought with generational wealth, and handed over to men who physically aged past 21 but mentally calcified right around their sophomore year of college. They are the eternal frat boys, the trust fund party animals. And for the better part of a decade, they lived exactly 30 feet from my bedroom window. Most people would have gone to war on day one. I chose the path of Zen, letting the trees grow thick and my patience grow thicker. But every monk has a breaking point. And when mine finally snapped, I didn't call the police. I didn't write a passive-aggressive note. I reached for the power tools. When Kellen and Ryland first moved in next door, the neighborhood collectively held its breath. The house was a gorgeous piece of mid-century architecture that their parents had purchased, presumably to keep them out of their own hair. Within a month, it had devolved into a wasteland of crushed aluminum cans, dying lawn furniture, and an ungodly amount of neon beer signs glowing through the front windows. They didn't go to college. They didn't have jobs. They had an endless supply of disposable income and a dedication to day drinking that bordered on religious. By the second summer, they had managed to haul a stained, faux-leather sectional sofa onto their roof. It sat precariously on the sloping Spanish tiles, a throne from which they would survey the cul-de-sac drinking cheap lager for 48 hours straight, and on more than one occasion, urinating into Mrs. Gable's prized hydrangea bushes below. If you walked out to get the morning paper at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, you were guaranteed to inhale the skunky, pungent cloud of whatever bong they were ripping on their back patio. I had 2 young kids at the time. My husband Gareth and I sat them down early on. We explained that the men next door were simply confused adults and that the best course of action was to treat them like a bad weather system, annoying but entirely ignorable. And for the most part, we did ignore them. Our house was a sturdy 2-story built with excellent insulation. Gareth had spent a small fortune on double-paned, sound-dampening windows for the side of the house that faced their property. Furthermore, we allowed the row of Leyland cypress trees along the property line to grow completely feral. What started as a modest hedge soon towered into a dense, 20-foot wall of green needles and thick branches. It was a natural barricade against the chaos. Besides, I am a phenomenally heavy sleeper. I could slumber through a freight train derailing in my living room. The rest of the street wasn't quite as stoic. A bitter, invisible war raged around us. Neighbors formed alliances. The local noise control officers practically had Kellen and Ryland's address on speed dial, showing up with bored expressions to hand out citations that the boys would simply pay off with Daddy's credit card. The escalation was inevitable. One crisp autumn morning, Kellen stumbled out to his oversized, lifted pickup truck to find all 4 tires slashed to ribbons. The rubber was completely gutted, resting flat on the cold asphalt. Nobody on the street claimed responsibility. Nobody offered security camera footage. The silence from the neighborhood was deafening. For a brief, glorious window, the frat house went quiet. Paranoia seemed to seep into their alcohol-soaked brains, and the roof parties ceased. We thought, perhaps naively, that the slashed tires had forced them to grow up. Fast forward 8 years. My kids were teenagers, practically self-sufficient. Kellen and Ryland were now well into their 30s. By all biological and societal metrics, they should have transitioned into functional adulthood. Instead, the only thing that had changed was their hairlines. They still wore backwards snapback hats, they still left red plastic cups littered across their dying lawn, and their taste in heavy, bass-driven electronic music had somehow gotten worse. But my ability to ignore them had vanished, entirely consumed by a totally different kind of exhaustion. My father, Desmond, was dying. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory of the local hospital's intensive care unit. For weeks, my life had been reduced to the rhythmic, terrifying beeps of heart monitors, the sharp smell of iodine, and the crushing weight of watching a man I loved fade into a shell of himself. On a particularly brutal Friday, Desmond's vitals had plummeted. I stayed by his bedside for 36 straight hours. I held his frail, translucent hand, listening to his labored breathing, terrified that if I blinked, I would miss his final moment. By Saturday night, he stabilized just enough for the nursing staff to gently force me out the door. "Go home, Tamsin," the charge nurse had said, her hand warm on my shoulder. "You're no good to him if you collapse, sleep. We will call you if anything changes." I drove home in a fugue state. My eyes felt like they were lined with crushed glass. Every muscle in my back was knotted tight, pulling at my spine. I craved nothing more than the heavy, dreamless oblivion of my own mattress. I pulled into my driveway at midnight, the air was cool and crisp. And then, the bass hit. It started as a low, throbbing hum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes before I even opened the car door. I looked over, the frat house was illuminated like a nightclub. Strobe lights flashed frantically through the living room windows. The backyard was packed with a fresh crop of 20-somethings, screaming over the relentless, pounding rhythm of a terrible EDM track. Kellen was standing on the back deck, a funnel in his mouth, while someone poured a dark liquid down the tube. I stood in my driveway, too tired to even summon tears. I walked inside, locked the door, and crawled into bed next to Gareth, who was sleeping with a pillow wrapped tightly over his head. I closed my eyes, desperate for rest. But the noise was a physical entity. It bypassed the double-paned windows, it gnawed through the insulation. The bass was a rhythmic, concussive pressure against my eardrums. Thud, thud, thud. At 2 a.m., a girl shrieked with piercing, hysterical laughter right outside my window. At 3:30 a.m., something heavy shattered against the wooden fence dividing our properties. At 5 a.m., the music finally switched from electronic garbage to a screeching, off-key acoustic guitar sing-along. I did not sleep a single second. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling plaster, my mind oscillating between the image of my father fighting for his next breath and these overgrown toddlers squandering theirs. The exhaustion metastasized. It crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. By 6:30 a.m., the sun began to bleed over the horizon. The party next door finally choked on its own vomit and died. The screaming stopped. The guitar was abandoned. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the vampires in their dark, foul-smelling crypt. Gareth stirred beside me, blinking his eyes open. He looked at my face, pale and drawn, and then glanced at the digital clock. "They kept you up," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "All night," I whispered. My voice didn't shake, it was perfectly level. Gareth sat up, rubbing his face. He knew the hell I had just endured at the hospital. He knew exactly what this single night of sleep meant to my sanity. He looked at the wall separating our house from theirs. "What do you need?" he asked. I threw off the duvet. "I need to do some yard work." Gareth's lips twitched into a slow, wicked smile. He understood completely. Sunday morning at 7:30 a.m. is a sacred time in the suburbs. It is a time for silence, for weak coffee, and for reading the news in a bathrobe. It is absolutely not the time for what we were about to unleash. I marched down to the garage and bypassed the small, polite gardening tools. I walked straight to the heavy machinery. I dragged out our massive, industrial-grade portable Bluetooth speaker, the kind used for outdoor weddings and construction sites. I hauled it through the dewy grass, placing it directly against the wooden fence, pointing the massive subwoofers squarely at Kellen's bedroom window. Gareth followed behind me, carrying a heavy, rusted length of steel pipe he had salvaged from a plumbing project 3 years ago. In his other hand, he held a heavy-duty angle grinder attached to a thick orange extension cord. I pulled out my phone and connected to the speaker. I didn't want cool music. I didn't want heavy metal right away. I wanted psychological warfare. I wanted music that would induce nausea in a hungover brain. I cranked the volume dial to the absolute maximum. Barry Manilow's Copacabana erupted from the speaker with the force of a sonic boom. The trumpets blasted through the crisp morning air, bouncing off the siding of the frat house. I didn't stop there. I walked over to the shed and grabbed the gas-powered Husqvarna chainsaw. I checked the fluid, primed the bulb, and yanked the pull cord. The two-stroke engine roared to life, spitting a cloud of blue smoke into the air. I marched over to the row of overgrown cypress trees. I found a thick, stubborn branch right at eye level, directly adjacent to their back patio. I pressed the spinning, serrated chain against the wood, but I didn't cut through it. If you cut through a branch, the noise stops. Instead, I held the trigger at a steady half-throttle. The chainsaw chewed into the bark, whining and screaming, a high-pitched, mechanical shriek that rattled the fillings in my teeth. I just held it there, letting the engine whine, letting the chain smoke and spit sawdust. A few feet away, Gareth fired up the angle grinder. He didn't have anything productive to build. He just knelt on the grass, pressed the spinning abrasive disc against the useless steel pipe, and leaned into it. A shower of brilliant, blinding orange sparks sprayed across the lawn. The noise was apocalyptic. The screech of metal on metal cut through the air like a physical blade. It was a high-frequency squeal that perfectly harmonized with the roaring chainsaw and Barry Manilow gleefully singing about Lola the showgirl. We kept this up for 20 minutes. My arms were vibrating from the chainsaw. Sawdust coated my hair and forearms. When Copacabana ended, I switched the playlist to ABBA. Waterloo blasted at a volume that made the ground tremble. The cheery, upbeat piano chords were a violent assault on the senses. Screech went Gareth's angle grinder, sending another wave of sparks into the dirt. RNNNNNNNNNGH went my chainsaw, gnawing uselessly at the exact same notch in the cypress branch. By 9 a.m. I transitioned to AC/DC. The opening bells of Hell's Bells bonged ominously through the neighborhood. I kept sawing. Gareth kept grinding. We were covered in sweat, sawdust, and metal shavings. My exhaustion had vanished, replaced by a pure, unadulterated rush of adrenaline and spite. I was a conductor leading a symphony of mechanical torture. At 9:45 a.m., the back door of the frat house finally crept open. I didn't stop the chainsaw, I just turned my head. Kellen staggered out onto the patio. He looked like a reanimated corpse. His skin was the color of old oatmeal. He was wearing boxer shorts and a stained t-shirt, his hands clamped desperately over his ears. He squinted against the gentle morning sun as if it were a laser beam burning his retinas. A moment later, Ryland emerged behind him. He was wearing dark sunglasses, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in absolute agony. They stood there, swaying slightly on their feet. The noise was a physical wall hitting them. The AC/DC, the screeching metal, the roaring two-stroke engine. Kellen pointed a trembling, pale finger at our fence. His mouth opened, shouting something, but his voice was completely swallowed by the roar of the grinder. He looked pathetic, two grown men defeated by a pop playlist and some overdue yard work. I locked eyes with Kellen through the gap in the trees. I didn't look angry, I didn't look unhinged. I just gave him a polite, neighborly nod and revved the chainsaw slightly higher, the pitch spiking into a deafening squeal. Ryland turned around, dry heaving into Mrs. Gable's hydrangeas before stumbling back inside. Kellen stood there for 3 more seconds, the vibrations of the bass visibly rattling his loose t-shirt, before he too surrendered, fleeing back into the dark confines of his ruined house. I kept sawing that same branch for another 15 minutes, just to be absolutely sure the message was received. When Gareth finally killed the power to the grinder and I let the chainsaw choke out, the sudden silence that fell over the neighborhood was heavier than a wet blanket. I clicked off the speaker. I took a deep breath of the air, smelling of pine sap, exhaust fumes, and ozone. I felt completely, utterly vindicated. I walked inside, washed the sawdust from my arms, and finally crawled into bed. I slept for 10 unbroken, glorious hours. When I woke up, the hospital called. Desmond was awake, coherent, and asking for me. The crisis had passed, and as for the boys next door, the roof sofa disappeared by Tuesday. The bass never rattled my windows past 10:00 p.m. ever again. Sometimes, the most effective communication doesn't require words. Sometimes, it just requires a Barry Manilow track, a power tool, and the sheer, unyielding willpower of a woman who has simply had enough. There is a profound lesson in the mechanics of neighborly warfare. Patience is a virtue, and grace is a gift, but there is a distinct boundary where tolerance becomes complicity in your own suffering. You do not have to endure the selfishness of others in silence. Sometimes, setting a boundary isn't about having a quiet conversation, it's about making your presence undeniable. It's about fighting noise with a very specific, calculated kind of noise. If you've ever had to deal with entitled neighbors, or if you just appreciate a well-executed dose of petty revenge, hit that subscribe button. Share your own terrible neighbor stories in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your boundaries firm and your power tools fueled.